Donald, by the way, is Donald Kanak is the chairman of Prudential Corporation Asia, and is most visibly somebody who is has deep roots in the insurance sector, but leads a bit of a double life, although in no ways incompatible, leads a bit of a double life as a passionate advocate of a rational economic approach to climate solutions of deforestation and climate change, which he's been working on a great deal across much of his life, and is no stranger, I think, to the issue of resilience in its broadest sense from either of these areas of his lifelong interest. I just let me say parenthetically before we begin this discussion that Don offer Don a caveat here. Prudential is not a property or a catastrophe insurer, and so Don is talking about some of these issues in his own capacity. John, I thought we would start off, as we were discussing, just trying to set the scene a little bit and just ask ourselves the question, why is Asia at this point in time? Why does it seem to be the disaster center of the world? And what are some of the kind of key numbers that sit around all of that?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for a chance to be here, and this is a terrific opportunity to get a chance to collaborate, as Judith was emphasizing. This issue is something we all have to work together on across sectors. And the fact that this event is happening here in Singapore in the center of Asia is very appropriate, because if you look at statistics, and of course as an insurance guy, this is a lot of what we do, you see that Asia is sort of the epicenter of disaster. And there are a number of reasons for that, but let me just throw a few numbers out that might surprise some people, maybe not everybody here, because I know there are other experts in the audience in this area. In the last 20 years, 61% of global losses from disasters have happened in the East Asia Pacific. Over 1.6 billion people have been affected by disasters since 2000. 2013, we just take 1 year and it's only a snapshot in time. According to the statistics compiled by Swiss Re, the world economic loss from disasters was $140 billion. Now that's not, by recent history, a very, very big economic loss for disasters. If we go back to 2011, the number was over 300 billion. And if we think back to 2011, we had the floods in Thailand, the terrible catastrophe in Fukushima with the earthquake, plus a tsunami, plus then a nuclear accident. And then there were earthquakes in New Zealand, and there were floods in Australia. So altogether over 300 billion. Last year was 140 billion, still a very, very big number. 44% of that, 62 billion, is Asia. That's about double North America with 32 billion, or Europe with 33 billion. And looking beyond numbers of economic disaster, the human aspect of this is even more dramatic. There were about 26,000 dead or missing from disasters in 2013. 80% in Asia. About 21,000 were in Asia. And about half of that is Southeast Asia. So there's no denying that the Asian region is a place where we should be focusing on resilience. We should be focusing on this question of disasters, and particularly how to make disasters less disastrous. Just one more thing to mention is that if we look at the trends, these numbers overall, over long periods of time, are increasing, both in frequency and in terms of the numbers, in terms of the economic loss. If we go the period from 92 to 2001, take a 10-year period, globally about $80 billion average per year. In the following 10 years, 2002 to 2011, 115 billion average per year. Now you see the recent numbers have been much higher. Even if we take out the biggest disasters of the two periods, Kobe earthquake in '95 and Fukushima in 2011, we get something in the order over 50% increase in average losses.
Don, you're talking about a tremendous difference between regions and locations in kind of insured losses, particularly versus the total losses in Asia. What's behind that?
Well, the numbers I was giving were the total losses, and I think this is you're highlighting an important point. The total economic loss is not the same number as the insured loss, and Asia stands out in the sense that there's a significant gap. And again, I'm not coming from the property casualty industry, and there are others here I hope will comment on this. But if we go back to that 2013 number of 140 billion globally, if we look at North America, almost 60% of their loss, 32 billion, 19 billion was insured, about 60%. For Europe, its number is a little lower. It's 45% was an insured loss. In Asia, that number is slightly less than 10%. And I think that's for a number of reasons. Okay, we look at a tremendous diversity of economic development in Asia. We're sitting in a place with a per capita income of over $50,000 per person. There are parts of ASEAN where the per capita income is under $1,000. Okay, so in those particularly areas, countries which still are at an earlier stage of economic development where there's more poverty, a less developed insurance industry, also tend to have high proportions of vulnerable people and vulnerable infrastructure. So I think that contributes to it, but it's clearly a gap in terms of insurance coverage.
I mean, that raises a question about a broad human intentions. I mean, how do we explain how humans generally, I mean, obviously Asia's got these very varied development issues, but how do we explain how humans generally are so disastrous about preemptive thinking? I mean, it's obviously something that underpins the whole conversation that we have today.
This is something I think we'll turn to philosophers and sociologists about. It's something, I mean, I'm just to share a bit of a personal story. I'm probably I've been at this, thinking about this for a long time. You probably won't meet anybody else who wrote his undergraduate honors thesis in 1975 on the economics of solar heating and cooling. Okay, that's me. So, and back in 1975, I could give you, and I did give some people a very, very convincing argument why even then solar heating and cooling was an economical proposition. Why didn't people do it? So I think it seems that we're always trying to confront this thing as why don't people act preemptively? And I've sort of come down to it in a very simplistic format, thinking there are two things that really make a huge difference. One is the question of personal impact. Does this affect me or does it not affect me? And the other question is a question of time, right? Is it now or is it some point, somewhere, someday, maybe, okay? So think of that as a two-dimensional matrix. Now versus then, and me versus not me. Things that are right now and affect me or affect us, right? If there was a problem, if somebody rushed into this room and threatened us, we would all be ready to act because it's now and it's us. But when it's in the future, it's not so good. So we deal with this in the insurance industry all the time, right? How many people, for how many years were told, if you smoke, you will get old quicker, you will have a higher chance of heart disease, you'll have a higher chance of lung cancer, you will probably die sooner, and yet people continue to smoke. Right? So in the future, we didn't act. People are told you should be safe for your retirement. I've got all sorts of data that shows that people know they should, they want to, they plan to, but they don't, or they don't save enough. So even in our own personal space, that time dimension confounds us. For some reason, we don't seem to get around to acting. What about the case where it's now, but it's not me? So I call that the distant future. The distant present, right? The distant present, it's now, but it's not me. That people are hungry in places of the world. Not here in this room, but somewhere. There's poverty. There are refugee issues. That's somewhere else. It's not me. Now, again, we're not so good at dealing with that. But we've developed institutions to deal with both of these first two cases. Institutions where it's me, but it's the future. We have an insurance industry. We have pension funds. Here in Singapore, we have mandatory pension funds, which are saved up huge amounts of money for the population. In the case of where it's now, but it's not me, we have the Millennium Development Goals. We have the United Nations. The biggest challenge, we come back to this issue of resilience and climate change, is it's the double whammy. It's not now, and it's not me. It's in the future, and it's not directly affecting me or us today. And we're just not very good at dealing with that. And we haven't yet evolved an institutional architecture, globally or sometimes regionally, to help us deal with that quadrant.
Well, let's take your thought about resilience a little bit further and just ask you what your own sense of resilience is, or what is it and what is it not?
Well, I mean, I think Judith did a good job of laying out that a lot of the thoughts around that. Resilience is being, in my mind, is being prepared for whatever, right? What's coming down the track, and that makes it very complicated. And if I have a few observations on it, the fact that it's in the future, and this confounding thing, if it's not me and it's not, means that we're really underinvesting in it. We, as a company, a few years ago, we tried to be very strategic to step back and think, how would we look at this question of resilience and what could we bring to this strategically? And we did the research, and people here know this, but if you look at the global spending in this area, it has this pattern. Low, 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 a disaster hits, boom, there's a spike, and then a few months later, boom, it goes back down low, 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 low. That's, suddenly it came to the president, it became to be me, I give money, or big, a rush in of philanthropy. We decided to place our efforts this way, the opposite curve. So on disaster risk reduction and disaster rebuilding. And I think if you look at that in a more holistic sense, the economics of that are really compelling in the sense of $1. There are different people have different organizations that put different numbers out. $1 spent on disaster risk reduction has $4 of avoided cost in disaster recovery. Somewhere between $2 and $10, depending on the ADB, I think is on the panel later today or discussing, has a whole range of areas for investment from modeling and flood control, modeling and prediction, to early warning systems, to strengthening housing resistance, to replanting of mangrove forests along the coastlines, which have incredibly high ROIs. The challenge is getting more investment sort of channeled into these things, because the return on all of these areas is very high.
You said that you thought resilience was also about the unwanted consequences of change or disruption. Could you talk a little bit about what you think resilience is not?
Well, I think we chatted a little bit about this previously. There can be a natural tendency to try to have a resistance to a solution because it's not comprehensive enough. Okay, there's two issues that I think we have to fight as we work through this resilience thinking. One is that we wait for the full, complete, comprehensive solution before we do anything. The other is that we see change, that somehow resilience it becomes a reason for resisting disruption. Okay, so let me talk about both things. Let's take the second one first. We shouldn't feel, in my mind, that because there's a disruptive technology or there's change required, that that's a sign of bad resilience, right? The existence of a strike might be interpreted as social unrest. Oh, our city isn't resilient. Or you could say, well, this is an example of a society which can handle labor conflict in an appropriate way, as long as the legal framework is in place. So I think we have to be careful that we don't use resilience as an excuse for social change, for not doing social change. But coming back, the thing about comprehensive, I've been in a number, I took 2 years out of my life in 06 and 07, by the way, another confession aside from being a solar housing guy, to work unpaid on climate change, okay? And area was forests, and how do we get a solution to deforestation, because deforestation, land use, actually contributes more, and I'm looking at Dr. Kuntoro, who is a global expert in this, contributes more emissions than all forms of transportation combined. And I was in so many meetings and so many global climate talks where it would be on the road to suggesting a solution. And because the solution doesn't solve every social problem, and there are many social problems, it's very difficult to get everybody in the room together around a consensus. And I think this is an issue that will, and maybe we'll talk more about this later today, Judith, is that, you know, in a city, because of all those complex linkages you described, sometimes you can be paralyzed because you can't solve everybody's problem with the same solution, and that means doing nothing. And one of the things I would add to your list of 5 is deliberate or urgent. There's a need to make decisions and move on. And in the resilience area, there you'll hear the phrase occasionally, I think it's a good one, that we shouldn't make perfect the enemy of the good.
So resilience is not, in a sense, resistance to change.
It shouldn't be a resistance to change, and we can't
recognizing change.
Exactly.
Let me just come back. I mean, you were talking, you know, framing a lot of this in terms of disaster, but of course resilience is, as we heard earlier, very much broader. There are so many issues that impact upon us, cities, or generally resilience in general. Aging, it strikes me, just to take one example in Asia, of something that has not been thought through very well for the future, and there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done. It strikes me that aging is a very good example, isn't it, of the need for resilience.
Aging is a very good example. Again, it's in that distant, maybe not me, of course I'm aged, but I think society in general has not focused on this enough, and Asia might be particularly guilty of this, and I think it's not well understood across Asia, developing Asia included, how fast societies are aging. Everybody knows that Japan is a rapidly aging society, already quite aged. But just to give you a few numbers, I charted this down because it's not an area that's explicitly on the agenda, but it's a very good example of the need to focus on things in advance. The UK, to go from a young country to a mature country, the United Nations would say if your population, less than 10% of your population is over 65, you're a young country. When you cross 20%, you're a mature country. You're going to be an old country. So how long does it take you to go from young, 10%, to over 20%? How fast are countries making that journey? The UK, the time estimated is 7. By the way, population statistics are very stable. You can go to United Nations statistics. You go to various fact books. You can see these things. They all that. So this is, I think these numbers are relatively stable. 73 years for the UK to go from 10% to 20%. The US and the UK, by the way, neither country has reached 20%. The US is 55 years, so 2 to 3 generations. Japan made that journey already in 21 years, from 1985 to 2006. China will do it in 18 years, possibly 19, but less than Japan, depending on whether you use the low fertility or the medium fertility, but let's say 18, 19 years. We know China's aging. Korea, 18 years. But what you don't know, perhaps, is that Thailand will make that journey in 16 or 17 years, starting 2014 to 2030. Vietnam will make it in between 17 and 20 years, so also faster than Japan. It has 10 years before it reaches 10%, but then very quickly. Okay? I could go through other lists. Even Indonesia, even the Philippines, which currently are enjoying an incredible demographic dividend, and they've got a couple of decades before they reach that 10% number, but will rapidly, probably half the time of, say, the US, to reach. And why is that? Life expectancies are extending rapidly, healthcare is improving, nutrition is improving, people are living longer, and birth rates are dropping. And that comes along with urbanization and the improvement of education. So this is an example of an area where, you know, we need to respond with pension systems, with financial literacy, with the development of capital markets so that there can be long-term investments and people can save, and of course life insurance. But the point is there's a need to move on this quickly, and a lot of the countries that are facing this rapid aging haven't yet put these systems in place. Singapore happens to be one that acted a long time ago, has been put that in place, but not every country in the region has done that.
Well, let me just pick up on that point you raised about development of capital markets. I know that might be a slightly counterintuitive to the broader discussion here, but economic development, it seems to me, is absolutely fundamental to creating, or at least being able to pay for, greater levels of resilience. And of course, one of the issues that we face in this region is relatively poor, relatively shallow capital markets in many countries. It's quite evident to me that, it seems that is where at least part of the discussion needs to focus, isn't it, on how the private sector and governments can work to deepen capital markets so that there is then the means by which to underscore infrastructure, for example, and pay for the various things that allow resilience to take place. There is a broad macroeconomic set of issues that resilience really needs to be underpinned by.
Yes. Well, I think you've said it. I mean, if you think about what the foundation of resilience must rest on, it should be resting on sound economic development. Jobs are underpinned through education, a legal system, and then infrastructure. And if we look at the numbers that are needed for infrastructure, and every government has its projections, but we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars over the next 10 years in the Asia region. Okay, how do we fund that when we don't have? I mean, you think about what are the logical sources of long-term investment in an economy? People probably immediately think, well, what about banks? Well, the challenge of banking is that a bank funds its operations through deposits, which are very short-term. Put your money in the bank, you want to be able to get it out. So banks, and particularly as new capital regimes are developing following the financial crisis, are not supposed to be making lots of long-term investments. Their assets, if they can't be long-term, if they're short-term liabilities, because that's a mismatch. You want your money back, but the money's been lent for 20 years, So banks are, in a sense, not able to fund the infrastructure development of the future. Who's the logical group to do that? Well, you need pension funds. Go back to the problem of aging. In fact, these are not competing needs. By developing pension funds, by developing the life insurance industry to meet the aging problem, you're creating large pools of domestic capital, not necessarily in bank deposits, but in longer-term savings and investment, that can be channeled into infrastructure. But how would it get channeled? You need government bond markets. You need a market for infrastructure investing, long-term debt, and equity and infrastructure. So the capital markets are kind of the link between the pension system, insurance system, and the infrastructure funding. And so around the region, I think there's an increasing understanding, and the governments you find around the region are focusing on this now, creating a vibrant, deeper government bond market so you can have what we call a yield curve in the investment world, a long-term investment pricing mechanism, and then corporations and infrastructures and so forth can issue bonds following along after the government has created that yield curve. So it really, there's a lot of work to do on the capital market side, and that's sort of, in a sense, financial market infrastructure that would enable the redeployment of this domestic savings in the region and from the West, actually, into infrastructure and help create that sounder economic development foundation for resilience.
So that raises...
Not to mention resilient infrastructure that needs to be funded, right? So how are we going to fund, better water systems, better transportation systems, resilient mass transit? That requires long-term bond markets.
Of course, the insurance sector is also involved in a number of innovations around some of the risk products, some of the means of creating a market for, say, for disaster resilience, for example. So could you just tell us a little bit about some of those products? And then I'm going to throw it to the floor just to see if there are any thoughts and comments from the floor.
Well, what I think, well, I'll give you a couple of examples. There are, the traditional, we talked earlier about, the insurance gap, if you will, for some of the casualty insurance, but there are a lot of innovations coming about that some of which have begun to come to Asia, and that involve combining sort of traditional insurance ideas with the capital markets. One of them, just to give an example, after Hurricane Sandy in New York, where there were massive billions of dollars of losses due to storm surge. a lot of seawater found its way into Manhattan and areas surrounding Manhattan. And for the Mass Transit Authority, with subway tunnels, that incurred billions of dollars of loss. Some creative people managed to create a solution going forward, which is very interesting, which is the challenge if you're a municipality or a transit authority is if you use traditional insurance, you have a loss, you have to prove you had the loss, you have to value the loss, you make a claim, the insurance company will evaluate the claim, then if they will pay the claim. That takes time. But you need money right away to provide relief, to start rebuilding. How do you provide disaster risk financing very quickly? And what's evolved is a concept of parametric triggers. It's a fancy word for don't think about the loss, think about did the catastrophe happen or not. If it did, then money becomes available. Okay, so two quick examples. One is in this Mass Transit Authority for New York, GC Securities, Goldman Sachs were the lead underwriters. GC Securities is part of Marsh McLennan, to issue a cat bond into the capital markets with parametric triggers, based literally places in around Manhattan there where they would measure whether the tide reached a certain level. If it reaches a certain level, that automatically triggers a payment from the cat bond. No arguing about whether the loss occurred or not. It pays. Similarly, last year, and I haven't found an example of it being implemented yet, but there was an announcement last year where Munich Re, Willis Re, and the United Nations Office for Disaster Resilience, Disaster Risk Reduction, combined on something called PRISM, the Philippines Risk Insurance for Municipalities, something like that, which is the same kind of idea that a municipality in the Philippines could apply for coverage that in the event of rainfall reaching a certain level or wind reaching a certain level or a storm, a direct hit of a storm, that there'd be automatic disaster finance become available. Okay, so you, in a sense, you're paying an insurance premium, if you will, but instead of having to prove loss, you just have to show that the disaster happened and the money is available immediately. And so there are innovations starting to happen, and there are other examples of, in other markets around the region, but those are just a couple.
I'm not entirely sure that PRISM has been executed, has come into force, has it?
It was announced. It is. I'm told it's enforced, but I haven't found a municipality that's done it yet. So maybe later today somebody will stand up and
perhaps the finance secretary from the Philippines will be able to talk a little bit about that. Let me throw this to the floor and just ask whether there are observations and thoughts around these sort of opening remarks, these scene-setting remarks. Perhaps somebody from the insurance sector, down over there. Thank you. Could you just say your name and your organization as you make your comments, please? It's a microphone there.
My name is Hari Hegde, and I work for an Indian IT company called Wipro. Now, actually staying put with this issue of me and now, my argument is that at least when it comes to Asian countries, specifically for India, we will all be forced to invest as well as intervene in building better resilient cities. The argument is this. Let me pick up three key stakeholders. Let me pick up the government. In the case of India, we are 50% agrarian, contributing to about 13% of the GDP. And the urban population today is about 30%, at about 370 million, which is expected to grow to about 950 million by 2050. So it's clear to governments that cities underpin the economic growth of these countries. Second thing that's happening, if you look at our electoral process, governments are getting voted in and out based on their performance. So for the governments in India, in these countries, it's now and it's me. Yeah. Next, let me pick up the people. There's a huge amount of urban migration. People are far more aspirant. Their aspirations are much higher. So they are getting active in the way, in the electoral outcomes and in the way governance happens in these countries. the third bit, let's look at businesses. If you look at, say, India, it's service industry driven, so essentially anchored hugely in cities. If you look at the growth of cities in India, the percentage of marginalized is only increasing. Hence, there is an issue of inequity, a serious risk to businesses. At the same time, you have a large underserved population, hence also a business opportunity. So my argument is for all the three, it's getting to be me and now. Hence, there is a significant argument, and I believe that there is a significant trend towards investing in resilience in cities.
Donald, would you like?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that we Prudential and our Prudence Foundation, when I mentioned that we did this strategic look a few years ago, we realized that there is an increasing recognition on the part of all of the parties that this is here and now. And we actually, in asking ourselves, what can we do since we're present in 13 markets around the region and we have over 400,000 employees and salespeople, and that puts us in most of the communities. We realized that we could gather people and bring them together to talk about these things. And so we brought in Jakarta in 2013, Manila this year, and then next year we'll be in Hanoi. Civil society, governments, we convened a disaster risk reduction forum, businesses. And what came out of this was just how many businesses, for example, are working with governments to not just do what I would call typical CSR. So CSR 1.0 is you don't do any harm and you obey the law. 2.0 is you contribute money. 3.0 is you also have volunteers. What's 4.0? In my definition, CSR 4.0 is when you use a strategic capability of a company to work with the government, to work with a civil society partner, to change the trajectory of a problem right now. And what we discovered in bringing these forums together, there's all sorts of examples right here and now of companies in doing what I call the CSR 4.0. A couple of examples. Deutsche Post, DHL, has 400 people. What do they grow? They move thousands of things every day. Logistics, just extraordinary around the world. 400 people who are trained to move when there's a disaster, go to an airport, go to a port to help moving relief supplies. When they have another program called GARD, Getting Airports Ready for Disaster. People who are trained because of the strategic ability of that company to go to an airport that wants to be disaster resilient and help the people who manage that airport make it more disaster resilient and make it able to recover from a disaster quickly. The Thai floods in 2011, Coca-Cola. I mean, they make very tasty beverages, but they're also brilliant at advertising. They took weeks of advertising budget, and instead of just advertising to sell Coke, they advertised for flood relief, contributions, and volunteers. Boom, record amounts of both came in. We started a program with National Geographic and with support from the Red Cross to do just basic disaster awareness, again, across these communities using terrestrial TV and working with governments called Safe Steps. Just very, very basic application of where you're present in 10 different languages, getting out information for people to get them out of the way of a disaster with a very, very powerful spokesperson who can gather attention. In this case, Manny Pacquiao, I don't know if you know the boxer, but extraordinary resilience response that you can create. So again, companies around the region are already acting. India has some other good examples as well. So I think your point is exactly right. It's just a matter of tapping into that and getting more companies involved.
Well, look, I do wish, Ivo, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to come to you at another point in the day, but I do wish we could carry on this conversation, but the red light is flashing, and we do need to move to the next session. But please do join me in thanking Don for his opening comments. Thank you, Don.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.